I've always imagined what Gilly's first trip with Christopher John would be like. There's this whole dreaminess to the description that Mary Stewart brings. You can almost feel her running her hands over the harebells, the long grass, looking up at these monoliths, bearing down on them, but not ominously. Not walking hand in hand, of course, but probably mentally they are. The whole idea of Christopher John recommending colourful flowers and plants that she can probably draw later on, talking to her at length about the war he has been, the poet he likes, his wife, this whole opening up in the middle of this pagan circle. It's perhaps where the magic of this book, the magic of Thornyhold, the magic of falling in love, the magic of those initial feelings, everything coalesces into this beautiful chapter of calm, quiet contentment. I can almost imagine Gilly feeling the sun on her face, smiling, looking at Christopher John, not with some kind of wide-eyed hero worship, but a true appreciation. And I can imagine Christopher John stealing glances at her and appreciating her for everything she is, and probably recognizing the fact that when Cousin Galis kind of gave him to understand that this was coming in his life, somewhere he had probably already known this was going to happen. This kind of magical inevitability is wondrous. I love both parts of it. The first part of kind of the bond becoming stronger, discovering more about the bond for the both of them. And then the second part, where we go right back into the core of Thornyhold, of Lady Sybil's gardens, of everything Lady Sybil, Cousin Galis have tried to achieve through Thornyhold, this protective, charmed house and garden, and its connections with the book. I think the chapter probably is the best example of bringing different kinds of magic, defining it, and coalescing it into one chapter. Perhaps I'm adding too much romanticism to the beginning of the chapter, but I think this is a book that demands romanticism. It's there in every page and every description of nature that we find Mary Stewart has put forth in the book. So I hope you enjoyed it just as much as I did, and we get to know further about how things are developing for Galis and Christopher John. Thornyhold by Mary Stewart, Chapter 21. We did see Stonehenge. In those days, it stood unfenced, deserted, small in the middle of the great plain. But as one left the road and walked to it across the grass, the stones reared themselves to their awesome height, and the circle closed round with its own old magic. This was certainly not the stone circle of my dream. There were harebells in the grass, and the lichen on the tall stones were beautiful in the sunlight, green and amber and furry grey as chinchilla. The breeze in the long autumn grasses sounded like the ripple of a slow river. Late though the year was, an occasional bird call echoed over the plain. Above us, the sky arched, enormous wisps of cloud breaking and forming and flowing through the blue like the creaming of a quiet sea. There was no one else there. We walked slowly round between the massive menhirs, while Christopher John told me about the place. Nothing was known, he said, about its origins or the great men of our prehistory who had built it, but there was evidence to show where the stones had come from, and this, considering their size and the distances involved, was barely credible. Of course, legends had arisen to explain the apparent miracle of the building. It had been erected in a night by Merlin, and King Uther Pendragon lay buried at its centre. The Druids had sacrificed their wretched victims there. Its builders had oriented it towards the rising sun of the summer solstice, and people still came sometimes to pray there and watch for wonders. It was 1,000-mile stone on the path of some sky-haunting dragon. None of it, truth or legend, was needed to enhance the magic of the place. For me, that was there in the clean air and the breeze on the grasses and the singing of happiness. We had tea at Avebury, at an inn in the very centre of another circle, so vast that the whole cannot be seen from any of its stones. Parts of it were lost in the fields round and about, and a village with its roads and lanes cut here and there through the ring. We made no attempt to walk round it, but drove home instead by green byways where Christopher John stopped the car once or twice to let me gather wild flowers and berries to draw, I told him. I used to do a lot, but I had to let it go rather, and I'd like to start again now that I've got the house straight. And all the time we talked, that fit of shyness had passed as if it had never been, and the earlier ease had come back. I forgot now all that we talked about, but at length, on the way home, I began to learn about him. We stopped beside the river bridge over the Arn, with the ruins of the old abbey beyond the trees, catching the reddening rays of the sun, and he sat on the parapet and talked while I gathered bryony from the hedgerow and glossy berries of honeysuckle, and a handful of the exquisite late harebells that look so fragile, but are as tough as wire. He had served through the war in the Western Desert. He said very little about that, except that he had known Sidney Keyes, the young poet who was killed in 1943 at the age of 20, and who, had he lived, said Christopher John, would have been one of the greatest of our time. In fact, is even so, he said. Do you know his work? I don't think so. I'm afraid I haven't read poetry much at all lately. I used to love Walter Delamere, the sweetest singer and one of the most profound thinkers of our age. It sounded like a quotation, which it apparently was. He was my wife's favourite, he said. She worked as a poetry editor for the Aladdin Press. She and William stayed with her sister in Essex during the war, but she had to go up to London for a meeting, and there was a raid that night. She was killed, while I was sitting quite safely somewhere near Tobruk. William can just remember her. He went on then to tell me about her. Cicely. William's mother, dead these 6 years. He spoke of her with love, but without grief. 6 years, and whatever the loss, happiness steals back. "It comes suddenly like the sunrise at Stonehenge," he said, looking away through the trees, where the ruins, robbed of the last sunlight, showed ghostly grey. "Look, there's a spike of wild arum by the Abbey gateway. What could you want better than that for colour?" We got back to Thornyhold at dusk. Christopher John saw me to my door, unlocked it for me, declined to come in, and tripped over Hodge on his way down the path. I heard the car door open and shut. I snatched up Hodge and kissed him and said, "Oh, Hodge," and turned to run upstairs. Outside, the car's engine started, idled briefly, was killed. Hodge kicked me furiously and leaped from my arms as Christopher John came rapidly up the path again, carrying the flowers I had picked and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "You left your flowers. I'm afraid they got a bit squashed, but they might come round." "Oh dear, they were on my lap, and I forgot all about them. They must have slipped off and got trodden on. I'm terribly sorry." "Don't be. It was a good thing as it happens. Reminded me of something I ought to have brought back weeks ago. Miss Saxon asked me to keep it for you. Here it is now, with apologies. And thank you once more for a wonderful day." Before I could answer, he had sketched a salute, turned and gone. This time the car started with a roar and went quickly away. Hodge said something urgent from the buyer's door, so I pushed it open and carried flowers and package to the kitchen. Flowers first into a jug of water, Hodge's supper next, or there would be no peace at all. Finally, to unwrap the package. Whether by witchcraft or not, I knew already what it would contain, and it did. Lying there on the table beside the sherry bottle and the jug of wild flowers was Goody Goslow's own home remedies and receipts. Of course I took the book to bed with me, and of course I sat up half the night reading it. Reading, that is, as much of it as I could. Agnes had been right. The crabbed, spidery hand and the faded ink made some of the words indecipherable. But a modern hand, my cousin's, had translated the worst of the words, and had also penciled in notes or even corrections to the old recipes. For that is what they were. If I had expected a book of magic spells, I was disappointed. It was just what the title had promised, a book of recipes and home remedies. Some of them Cousin Galis had obviously tried and used. Here and there she had added notes. "This works well, but used sparingly. Half the dose for a child." Or, "Too violent. Try indecipherable instead." And a further note. "Yes." The comfrey salve was there. For the ointment, digest the root or leaves in hot paraffin wax, strain and allow to cool. I read it with a prickling of the skin at my own foreknowledge and a smile at Cousin Galis's note. Culpepper's recipe. Sovereign inside or out. Against another recipe she had written, "It won't grow here. Italian. Ask CJ." The book was not set in order. That is, the recipes seemed to have been written down as they were acquired or tried out, so that soups, pies, puddings, and so on were interspersed with pickles and wines, medicines, and household cleansers. The medicines, and of course the preserves and wines, used plants, herbs, fungi, mosses, the barks and sap of trees, every imaginable product, not only of the garden, but of the hedgerows and streams and woods. I read on, and as I read, an idea began to grow, and gradually took hold of me. To begin with, I had assumed, with a good deal of misgiving, that I should try to follow in the steps of Lady Sybil and Cousin Galis, and become in fact, and not merely in jest, the third witch of Thornyhold. But what I had seen of my cousin's library and the contents of her still room, her professional life tidied away to make room for something new, had convinced me otherwise. Things had changed. Even to myself I would not acknowledge how, but I knew that the lifetime study given by my spinster cousin would take more time and dedication than I, with marriage and a young family, was likely to have. So our minds leap ahead of facts or even probabilities. But mine made the leap, and I knew at last just what I had to do. The talent you're born with. I would use it. My one real talent, and make drawings of all the plants and fungi with descriptions and notes of their habitats, and perhaps some day make an illustrated book of the sovereign remedies and recipes of Thornyhold. Christopher John would advise me, but whether it made a publishable book or not, I would do it for my own pleasure, and in the doing, perhaps, learn how to use in my own way the gentle powers of garden and woodland. I would start tomorrow to make a fair copy of Lady Sybil's book, and perhaps even try out some of the recipes for myself. I remembered then that I had promised to let Agnes see the book. That first, then. Tomorrow, as ever was I, would gather my new courage, take the book down to the lodge, and get answers to the questions I wanted to ask. But no mention, no hint at all, of brambles and the quarry and Boscobel. Brambles. A thought struck me, and I picked up the book again. I checked through it curiously, but there was no recipe in it for bramble jelly. Beyond the open window the owl hooted. Overhead some small clawed creature pattered among the remains of the pigeon's grain. Beside me, snugged deep in the eiderdown, Hodge purred suddenly, then switched off like Christopher John's engine. A big moth flew in and beat crazily at my bedside light. I reached to switch off and give the creature a chance to get away and back into the cool night. No recipe for bramble jelly. That had been Agnes's excuse for getting me to look for the book. If she had wanted some of the herbal recipes for herself, surely she would have said so. But there had been those elaborate lies about Miss Saxon's jelly was always the best, and the special recipe that must be in this book. And this was certainly the book with that difficult handwriting that she had not had time or chance to make out. Conclusion? That the book contained some other recipe that she wanted, but did not want to talk about. And on the heels of that conclusion, another, that whatever it was, Cousin Galis had not wanted her to have it, had perhaps found her examining the book, and so had taken the precaution of lodging it in Christopher John's safekeeping till my arrival. I switched the light on again. The moth had gone. Hodge half opened an eye in reproach, then shut it again, stretched luxuriously, and sank back into sleep. I reached to pick up the book. Its cover, never a very strong one, had split with long usage, and the backbone had broken, letting the stitching go. My action in stretching for the bedside lamp had tumbled the book aside, so that it slid half-opened across my knee, while a loose page slid out free of the rest. I picked this up and opened the book to replace it, glancing at it half-idly as I did so. It looked and felt different from the rest. A thicker, yellower paper, brownish ink, splotches and blots made perhaps by a quill pen, and in a different, older hand. A recipe supplied by an altogether different person from the virtuous ladies Sybil Goslow and Galis Saxon. A recipe belonging to the book I had expected to find. The only recipe that could claim to be real magic, and pretty certainly the one that our local witch wanted so very badly. It was called simply The love filter. I think that my first emotion was recoil, then woman for woman, a sort of pity. Afterwards, sharply, and still woman to woman, a flash of uncertainty. Am I wrong about the way he feels for me? And finally, an incredulous, supposing the damn thing works. I picked up the thick, tatter-edged parchment and read it through. The love filter. Take the wings of 4 bats, 9 hairs from the tail of a newly dead or dying dog, the blood of a black pigeon, and seethe together with... I omit the rest. But there already, with no questions asked or possible to ask, was the answer to another of my questions. I sat there in the dark for a long time, trying not to blame Agnes for what I told myself was an uneducated countrywoman's attitude to animals. For Agnes, as for many of her kind brought up in the remoter countryside of the 40s, all wild creatures were vermin. A cat was tolerated only as it would kill mice or birds, even the robin. A dog only as it would work or act as guard. She would think nothing of wringing the necks of my stray pigeons, or drowning the ownerless Hodge, or keeping the wretched Rags for her witch's cauldron. I could acquit her of the injury to Rags inflicted by Jessamy in his unthinking simplicity, but it was impossible and surely wrong to forgive the cruelty that had tied him up and kept him on starvation rations for the sake of this repulsive spell. I was trying so hard not to blame Agnes that I found I was shaking. I told myself that my own deep and even obsessive love for animals was a personal thing, a product of my own happiness and lack of self-confidence. Animals were safer and far kinder than people. It was I myself, in my inadequacy, who was abnormal, not the simpler, more extrovert people with their robust attitudes to the natural world. I thought suddenly of my father's curate, now himself long dead, and what he had done with my rabbit. Presumably he had bred the rabbits for food, and if a child had kept one for love, and subsequently returned it, it would go back into the category of meat. Fair enough. I ate meat myself. The wrong had been done, not to the rabbit but to the child. And my mother with the dog. She had been the product of a tough pioneer society, hacking a living out of the New Zealand bush, where animals were stock or game, and there was no room in the poverty of a hard-working life for sentiment. Even the children would be regarded as working tools, and daughters in consequences as less desirable than sons. The wrongs of my childhood, if they were that, could with this sweating effort of the imagination be understood and forgotten. So the obscene love filter led me, through that long night, to the exorcism of my own miserable spectres, and finally to an exhausted kind of peace. When at last I slept, I dreamed not of stone circles and dying dogs, but of pigeons flying against a high blue sky, and Christopher John smiling and saying, "Happiness comes back in the end." And with that, we end chapter 21.